Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second to last week of classes. Hooray! So for this class, you should have read Chapter 2 from A Future History of Water, focusing on the index. Before I get into the particulars, I want to talk a little broadly, which is that one of the things that I really like about this book is the way she interrogates these constructions of human rights and the entanglement of human rights and capitalism within these very highly technical frameworks, these devices like the index. And what she's doing here in a really kind of elegant way is creating an ethnography of statecraft and capitalism and the governance of things like human rights and water access. One of the things that I'm kind of meh about with this book, and I have the same issue with the last book, is the way in which they tend to be very, what I would describe as disciplinary, or even pretentious. So, I always say you should understand, critique comes after understanding. I don't want to critique this and then have you hate the book and not pay attention to it. It's worth reading. I'm assigning it because it's worth reading. But critiques are also useful. And I don't know if this is super apparent for y'all, but one of the things this book is doing is it is very, it's speaking from a specific intellectual tradition that I would say is high anthropological theory. If you've taken anthropological theory, I would describe it as high structuralism, or whether that's late structuralism or post-structuralism, depending on how you want to call it. But it emerges out of a very specific tradition in anthropology. And so while she's engaging with, for example, black feminist literatures, the organizing frameworks are largely coming out of who I would call the quote-unquote superstars of anthropology. Now, keep in mind Zoe Todd's critique of this idea of the academic superstar from the beginning of the class, this idea that there are certain people who are the high theorists, and we should all be talking to them, or talking about their work. The problem is high theorists tend to be that way because they work in elite institutions where they have a lot of resources and very little teaching responsibilities, which creates the economic conditions for them to be at the core in a way that's often not very accessible. It's also kind of, it creates a dynamic, right, where all of anthropology is talking to the sinner. And because we're all talking to the sinner, we're not talking to the margins. And one of the things that the earlier books have talked about, books like Sanjay's book and Simpson's book, are really about having conversations at the margin. How does anthropology engage with other disciplinary fields and problems? How does anthropology do socially engaged work? How does anthropology speak to indigenous people or indigenous issues? As opposed to anthropology for the sake of anthropology, which is a set of issues we've been critiquing this whole class. And so there's a really prominent difference between this last book and those books we started off with in those kinds of ways. This is not to say that Ballesteros' book is not politically useful or can't be used in other ways, but rather it's talking to a community of anthropologists specifically. And one of the questions I have, and one of the questions that I'm organized this course in order to help me think through, is there a place for anthropology in a burning world? Or is there a place for anthropology in a burning world? And if so, how does it need to adapt? How does it need to be transformed and look different? And I'm not convinced that what the future will hold is anthropology per se. I think anthropology provides useful toolkits like ethnography that we can analyze, like this emphasis on the nitty-gritties of the devices that help us understand the production of human rights and capitalism and statecraft. But I don't know that anthropology as we know it today is adaptable in the longue durée? That's an open-ended question that I'm trying to think through. In my own work, we kind of saw this, Singh kind of does the same thing. As much as I absolutely love that book, all of her metaphors are so grounded in bourgeois cultural forms, like music history, like citing things like Hamlet, or Shakespeare or whatever. It's rooted in a particular set of cultural examples and analogies and metaphors that are very class-based. So anyway, those are some problems I've been thinking through. Curious where y'all will go with them. So this chapter is about the index. What is an index? An index is an economics term. It refers to a statistical measure of change over time. I give you this diagram as an example of the misery index. When I saw the image of a misery index, I couldn't not include it. Basically, the misery index is a calculation that includes inflation and unemployment. And so what you can see with the graph, right, is it's changing the ways in which which inflation and unemployment shifts over time. The index is a measure of change over time. And specifically in this chapter, Ballestero is looking at the consumer price index. I'll define that later in this lecture, but basically what she says is the consumer price, and I'm sorry, this on page 76 is the thesis of the chapter. The consumer price index is a device that creates a difference between human rights and commodities in a surprising way by displacing the subject of rights and giving primacy to the household of goods. The consumer price index is a device that creates a difference between human rights and commodities in a surprising way by displacing the subject of rights and giving primacy to the household of goods. So what is human rights? When we look at the index, the human rights is actually defined through the concept of a household filled with economic goods, with economies. We calculate a human right through a household of economies. I'll explain that. In fact, this whole chapter, this whole lecture is organized around explaining that single assertion. And she continues, here we see how a society that is squarely organized around a liberal understanding of the human as a bearer of rights and as a citizen of the republic relies on purchased goods to determine the humanity of its subjects. In other words, once we start paying attention to the index, we're going to have to redefine our understanding of liberal governance, the idea of the human, the idea of human rights. So where do we start? We start with the problem of human rights and how these get defined in terms of affordability specifically, right? This is the core problem from earlier in I forget if it was last class or the class before. How do you provide water as a human right while also paying for infrastructure and market economies? And the rubric that gets used and the rhetoric that gets used in Costa Rica and internationally is affordability. So Ballestero introduces ASADAs, or basically community aqueduct associations. These are entities, community-run entities that manage aqueducts under the jurisdiction or under the direction of larger utility companies. A lot of the economics that makes ASADA's work, or ASADA's work, is through community volunteerism. There's a lot of unpaid labor that goes into keeping these infrastructures running. And Ballestero talks about a conference held in which a group of ASADA workers and others were gathered and talking about what they're doing. And one of the things that emerges in one of these conversations was this idea that water is a gift from God and from nature. And in response, another participant, Anna, breaks in and says, God and nature gave us water. It's a human right, I agree. But it's too bad God didn't put it in all of your houses. There's no question people have to pay for water. Our ASADAs cannot work otherwise. The issue is whether people can pay, whether they can afford their bills. And so here, Anna is critiquing this kind of rhetoric of God and nature. She's saying, sure, that's right, absolutely. Yet, when we talk about water in that way, we're obscuring the mechanics of how do we keep our community aqueduct associations running. How can we make sure that water is affordable, that people can actually pay for it? And here, I just want to pull out this really powerful quote that I really like from Ballesteros that I think is useful for all of us to think about. I think this is actually a really useful question for thinking about life in a burning world. She says, people with Anna's sensibility, particularly if they are women, are often considered too defiant, problematic. Instead of offering suggestions about how to deal with particular situations, people like Anna pose questions that do not seem to have apparent answers. They expand the parameters of discussion, maybe too much, bringing up the recalcitrance of the structures people want to, but seldom can transform. Most of the time, people like Anna are dismissed as being too idealistic or radical. Denaturalizing the monthly routines by which asadas collect their income, Anna creates a space to wonder about why things are this way. How could a sense of affordability entangle God and nature with water users and their unpaid bills? How are conflicting moral allegiances interlaced with practical demands to secure people's ability to take showers, cook, and have a glass of water when thirsty? I love this framework of radical questions without readily apparent answers. So this is something I'd like y'all to think about, maybe in the discussion post if you like, but certainly over time, I think this is worth reflecting on, right? What kinds of questions are too radical? What kinds of questions have no apparent answers, but instead demand that we expand the parameters of discussion? How do the parameters of discussion already fail to encompass what we need? How do the parameters of the discussion already foreclose our ability to adapt, to thrive, to live, to flourish? This is really one of the core questions of the course, right? Even going back to Sean Jay. How do the parameters of progressivism already foreclose the possibility of meaningful liberation? As it turns out, affordability has a international definition. According to the UN, the affordability of water as a human right is set at 3% of a household's income. That is an international standard, which regulators in Costa Rica can draw on, and do draw on. There's a couple problems, of course, right? This is it's a generic calculation. It doesn't pay attention to the specificity of, for example, what if you're unemployed? What if, what does it even mean to be able to afford income? As Anna says, right, it means different, like water and affordability means different things to different people. It means something very different in a working class home than, for example, a wealthy home who illegally creates an illegal pipe in order to fill up their pool. It means something different for community aqueduct associations than it does for large companies or for regulators. And all of that gets glossed over at the 3% of a household's income. But what is useful is that this provides something that can be operationalized. 3% can be inserted into formulas, into calculations. It's a useful index. It provides an entry point into useful indexes. And so because of that, it's operationalizable. It's useful for regulators. It's something they can do something with in a way that the more complex reality is tricky to manage, to govern. So here we get into regulators. From the UN's 3% that affordable means 3% of a household's income can be spent on water. We have regulators who are trying to manage utility costs. And one of the problems that this raises is they have to deal with inflation. Specifically, because of inflation, right? Water companies try to hike up prices or need to hike up prices depending on what perspective you're looking at in order to keep their services quality. Whose perspective you're looking at. And yet, does that make it affordable? So here inflation poses a problem. And and so when when Ballestero talks to regulators, one of the things they describe their work as providing a surrogate market effect. This is contradictory, but it's a useful contradiction to think with, both for us and for regulators. The problem is that water utility regulators need to ensure competitive quote-unquote prices and quality in the absence of a market, right? The ideology here is that markets are supposed to they're supposed to force companies to provide competitive prices and better products in order to outcompete each other. But the problem is markets don't actually guarantee that. Markets don't actually guarantee competitive prices and quality for water, which is why the state takes it over as a public good. And so this is the contradiction of of regulation as a surrogate market effect. How do you produce this artificial market effect of regulating prices and quality because of the fact that the market doesn't actually do any of that? And again, one of the problems that comes up is calculating inflation. And so in these two pictures, right, I've shown you a picture of a working class family's home and a very wealthy person's home, right? These are very different perspectives on what counts as affordable. But so how do water regulators calculate inflation rates, right? How do you know what the inflation in Costa Rica is? What is the value? Well, the answer is it's calculated through something called CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. And of course, the other issue here is that the 3% rule set by the UN in practice isn't necessarily the case for everyone, right? The average Costa Rican family pays between 1 to 3% of their income on water, which is within that threshold, and yet many households pay far more, especially households that are extremely poor in extremely rural settings, usually the ones that are serviced by these community aqueducts. And again, right, there's a story of a woman who's unemployed and pays about 8.5% of her income, which is entirely made up of state assistance on water. And so this is when we get into questions. Are you going to pay your water bill or your electricity bill this month? So what is the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI? According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, CPI is a measure of the average change over time in the prices paid by urban consumers in a market based of consumer goods and services. So basically, Consumer Price Index, if an index is a measure of statistical change over time, a statistical measure of change over time, the Consumer Price Index is a measure over how much key consumer goods cost and how that cost changes over time. This is what Costa Ricans talk about in terms of the cost of living. But the implication of this, right? So basically what regulators are doing is, in order to say how much is inflation cost, how much can these utility companies increase their prices based on inflation, the way they calculate that inflation is in reference to the Consumer Price Index. Keeping in mind, right, that if 3%, this goes back to the 3% rule, is that 3% is also, a dystopian show on Netflix that is actually also highly relevant to this, but I'm not going to get into right now. Anyway, 3% from the UN, not from Netflix, is sorry, my brain is just going on this tangent. 3%. If the cost of living is going up, how do you maintain water within that 3% margin while also I'm sorry, how do you keep it within that 3% margin considering that the cost of living is going up? And how do you calculate it? And what's inflation? How does that affect things like how much it costs to do repairs? Now, the implication of all this, right, is that when we talk about affordability, that the way affordability is calculated on a mathematical level is directly tied to inflation, which is directly tied to commodity markets. In other words, the way we're calculating water as a human right is directly tied to the calculation of commodity markets. Inflation literally is a function of consumer price index. The cost of water as a human right is directly tied to the consumer price index, to the shift in how much basic commodities and household goods cost and how those prices change over time. These two dimensions, the human rights and the commodity, are completely mathematically undisentangleable. Sorry. You cannot separate them. You cannot disentangle them. So, Ballestero gives us a table, table 2.1 and table 2.2, of changes in the kinds of goods that are included within the consumer price index. Now, as she says, each of these items have an interesting social history. Why at each particular moment does certain items get excluded from the calculations of CPI and other items get included? What's the history that makes those shifts seem reasonable? But she also gives a longer history of CPI calculations in Costa Rica and the ways in which what is being calculated has actually shifted in a fundamental way. So she notes that in 1936, this is all on page 93 and 94, in 1996 you see the first CPI calculation, and it was described as a cost of life index. In 1952, it was said to measure consumption, quote unquote, by middle-class consumers and working-class citizens. So we're measuring consumption by 1952. In 1964 and 1975, the index is described as a measure of the purchasing power of middle and low-income consumers. So from 1936, we see a shift from the calculation of CPI as a cost of life to, by the 1960s and 70s, to a measure of purchasing power for middle and low-income consumers. However, in 2004, the calculation of CPI gets described as, quote-unquote, a generic consumer index, without any reference to people or their economic class. Thus, and this is a quote, thus at the beginning of the 21st century, the CPI became a sign of an abstract consumer. So we see this shift in the way CPI is thought of over time in Costa Rica. And what we see by the end of the 2000s, and this is so important, is that it's imagined to be calculated in reference to an abstract citizen, an unmarked consumer. Someone who is not defined by class or race, just someone who is considered generic, a generic Costa Rican person, no one in particular. And this seems like a small technical shift, and yet the reverberations of these little technical redefinitions and the kinds of calculative logics that they sustain, that they animate, have profound effects in terms of how people are able to get things like water to drink. So one of the things that we see through this history of CPI calculations is actually a really radical redefinition of the household in Costa Rica. And Ballestero writes, while this shift from people to purchases may seem a small technical change, it's more than that. It's the statistical culmination of a trend for which the specific conditions of kin or class relations with their historical particularity are pushed into the background. Instead, we see the statistical emergence of the person in the household as an unmarked potential consumer. In this scenario, small human collectives, kin groups, become equal to their potential purchases. The household as an important unit of sociality, the household as an important unit of sociality is transformed into an empty signifier. A symbol without content is what that means. No assumptions of a nuclear family, a heterosexual reproductive nucleus, or an extended system of relations of care are necessary. The household becomes a statistically determined collection of things and services, the accumulation of the material traces left by transactions, and, only by association, a trace of the people who happen to be connected to those things and services. So here, Ballestero is describing a kind of shift from thinking about the household and thinking about CPI away from people and towards things. Now, in some ways, this is positive, right? She describes the way in which this reduces assumptions of like the heteronormative family that are built into systems of Costa Rican governance. On the other hand, in this production of the generic Costa Rican citizen, we come to see occlusion of people by their purchases. The household becomes defined as a norm, as a normative entity, but not a heteronormative entity, but rather a normative entity of purchases, of things and services. And so what gets measured with CPI is not about families directly. It's about normal or average collections of things that people own. In other words, right, what the CPI is measuring by the 2000s is what Ballestero calls a basket of goods, a collection of goods owned by the normative household that lets the state ignore things like class, race, kinship, the particularities of any household specifically. And so, again, we see the occlusion of people, or what she describes as subjects, by commodities, or what she calls objects, in the construction of the unmarked citizen. What is the citizen? The unmarked citizen is the objects consumed by the household, by the average household. This creates a problem, right? A lot of the regulators that Ballestero works with are really struggling with in an active way through things like interview techniques. How do you keep these abstract statistical figures to be connected with real concrete people in all their specificity? As we saw with the 3%, right? The 3% UN norm, UN definition. Those kinds of abstractions, those statistical abstractions, are useful because they can be operationalized by government entities. But how do you keep them to exist in reference to real concrete people in all their specificity in a way that 3% can never name? Now, Ballestero has this point that she's not talking about an alternative ontology, but a core of liberal society. I just want to explain that a little bit for y'all because there's a lot of background in terms of anthropological theory that is needed for that y'all may or may not have. This actually connects to the stuff we were talking about with Singh in terms of multi-species anthropologies and ethnographies. What she means by an ontology is a kind of theory of the nature of being. And when anthropologists talk about ontology, we're often talking about things like what's considered animate, what's considered inanimate, how do material things affect us in real ways or sustain us or animate us. There's different ways of talking about this. For example, I have a very deep affective relationship with my bed. When I get in it, I relax. My bed actually acts on me, right? It if I'm feeling bad, I might get in the bed and under my weighted blanket, and these material things act on me in a very agentive way. This is sometimes talked about as thing power or object agency. And the idea, right, is that humans don't exist in a vacuum. We exist in a material world, and without those materials, we ourselves have no agency. Agency emerges in collaboration with objects, as Singh would say. Now, we can also talk about ontology in terms of things like animist ontologies, understandings of animals as not simply lesser than humans, but persons with souls or spirits or whatever you want to say. Souls is probably a bad translation for a lot of animists, but we'll go with it for the sake of a simple, quick definition, quick and dirty definition. So what Singh is saying is it's not an alternative ontology here. This is not an ontology that helps us think about alternatives to statecraft or alternatives to capitalism. What we're seeing is the very core of liberal society as something that breaks down the primacy of the human, the primacy of the subject, and replaces it with the object, with the commodity. And so the implication of this is actually quite profound, right? What she's saying is that the reason why we can, or the implication is that the reason why we can be so attentive and we can see these contradictions between these ideologies of the human as if humans existed, this is a very racialized idea. The human is a very racialized idea of who gets counted as fully human. That's marked by exclusions, as I said, along race, as well as things like species. Singh called it human exceptionalism, the idea that humans sit at the top of the universe, that we're somehow exceptional and different from the rest of quote-unquote nature. And so what Ballestero is saying is that capitalism and liberal statecraft and human rights contain within them the very core of these object-oriented ontologies, this occlusion of the subject of humans. So human rights already destabilizes the concept of the human. That's how it functions in this nitty-gritty way through the index. And this is why this is how we can see this as a power relation. Right? We can see this construction of humanity and this construction of the object and the separation between subjects and objects as a power relation because it's fucking falling apart in our society. It's falling apart in our world, our globalized world. In a moment of environmental catastrophe and human rights, these concepts actually stop making sense. The primacy of the human stops making sense in the world we live in today. Now, the thing is, Ballestero is not saying that this is an inherently bad thing. It's not that, she writes, as many critics of capitalism claim, these economic indicators rob us of our humanity. We're not being robbed of humanity here. Rather, what the CPI does is changes how we count as humans. They're changing what it means to be human and how we construct this this cultural category of the human. They imbue the rights that make us human with commodities all the way down. Understanding how this happens shed lights on how economic logics, humanitarian and humanist commitments, and the material ontologies coalesce into the numeric creation of preconditions for the future. So what she's saying is how we're defined as human, how we define ourselves as human, is premised on commodities. There's no fundamental basis at the bottom of what it means to be human. It's commodities all the way down. Now, when Ballestero says this, she's referencing a Cherokee oral tradition here. The story is that there was an old man telling a story to a group of people, including an anthropologist. And he says, in the beginning, the world was created, and it was created as a turtle. It actually, more specifically, is the world sits on this turtle's back. And the anthropologist dutifully writes down the story, taking notes in their notebook, in their field notes. and then pauses and thinks for a moment and says, wait, something doesn't quite add up, and asks the elder, wait, so what's the turtle sitting on? What's the turtle on? If the world's on the back of the turtle, what is the turtle sitting on? And the elder thinks about this for a minute before replying and says, another turtle. And here the anthropologist thinks they get the contradiction. They think they understand something better. So they say, well, what's that turtle sitting on? And the elder smiles a little bit and says, oh, it's turtles all the way down. So that's what Ballestero is referencing, right? When we talk about the construction of human rights, the construction of what it is to be human, it's commodities all the way down. This is the condition of being human in 2021. This is the condition of having human rights. So as Ballestero says, that's not an inherently bad thing. It's not that we're being robbed of our humanity. It's that how we understand what it is to be human changes. But we might also, keeping in mind with this overarching question of what does it mean to do anthropology in a burning world, think back to Anna, who asks questions that have no ready answers, questions that demand we expand the scope of what we're talking about, that we imagine transformations that are not easily operationable, but rather question why the world is as it is. So on the one hand, what Ballestero is arguing is that this formulaic entity, that's probably the wrong word considering the last chapter, but this statistical entity, this economic construction of the index, while it seems like a small technical thing, actually has these profound social effects that transforms what it means to be human. What it means to be human by centering human rights on what is ultimately a calculation of consumer price index, which is ultimately a survey of how prices of household objects change. Another one of these massive, large-scale effects is the production of what Ballestero calls a folded temporality. So she's saying that the index actually produces nonlinear kinds of time. And what she notes, right, is the ways in which indexes are used in order to calculate in order to evaluate these reviews for price hikes or price increases, where regulators study utility providers' records, their financial records. And so in doing that, they study the history of earnings and incomes and expenses for the utility company in order to conduct this review. And they project that history into the future, literally creating a projection of costs and expenses over 3 to 5 years. And so Ballestero writes, regulators create a future image of a utility's operations for a period of 3 to 5 years. These projections produced out of past records allow regulators to fold past and future into the present. They generate a speculative futurity. So here regulators are, through this technical tool of the index, generating speculative futures that enfold past records into the present. And so through this chapter, Ballestero takes this little tool, the index, to talk about how human rights and commodities end up becoming two sides of the same coin. Right? She starts off with the question of human rights. Water is a human right. But what does that mean? How do you operationalize water as a human right? Given that you have to pay for infrastructure, that community organizations like Community Aqueducts are struggling to pay for that infrastructure to maintain it. And you get at this through the rhetoric of affordability, including with UN guidelines that affordability means 3% household income. That is the numerical figure for what it means for water to be a human right, according to the UN. From there, we get to the project of how regulators conduct reviews of water prices and calculate interest. They calculate interest through consumer price indexes. Consumer price indexes are in turn measured by looking at the changes in prices of household utilities. I'm sorry, not household utilities, household goods and services. By looking at everyday commodities and how these prices change. The effect, so what we're saying here, right, is that when we're talking about the operationalization of water as a human rights, water as a human right is calculated in reference to a household filled with commodities. That's how it's put into practice. And the impact, the larger social impacts of this project is the construction of what it means, the reconstruction of what it means to be human, of what the household is, and the creation of nonlinear temporalities. So such a small thing like the index has such broad implications in terms of how we understand everything from human rights to the human to statecraft. And so here's some quotes that I really like in terms of pulling together why all of this stuff matters. And in doing that, I'm going back to this idea of the cost of life from the beginning of the chapter. Well, regulators and economics people, whatever you call them, economicists, talk about consumer price index. Most people in Costa Rica talk about the cost of life. These are not exactly the same things, but they are related. You might even ask how they might be different in your discussion posts. Ballesteros writes, the household of the human right to water is the household of things. Literally, what does it mean to have a right to water? The human right of water is defined through, as a function of, the household of things. And I mean that in a mathematical sense. The human right to water is literally a mathematical function of the calculation of the cost of a household of things. Today, humanitarianism depends on floor wax, computer desks, software lessons, and cable TV subscriptions, regardless of their humans. Instead of thinking about human rights of subjects, we might have to start thinking about the rights of human objects. With this last quote, what Ballesteros is saying is we have to fundamentally redefine how we imagine human rights. Because, in practice, in actuality, human rights are defined in relation to human objects. In fact, it's more than in relation. They're defined in reference to human objects, not in reference to human people. And human people are merely an inference, a trace of those human objects. So here again we have Ballesteros giving us an elaborate argument about the complexities of the construction of human rights, the construction of commodities, the construction of statecraft, through the seemingly deceptively simple device of the index. Go forth and discuss. Here's some guidelines, if you need them, for structure, of things that might be interesting to talk about.